Ladies and
Perfect.
gentlemen, here is Fehr and the Baldoon Mystery. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the warm introduction, Claire and CJ, and for everybody who is joining us this evening. This picture that you see on the screen that I'm sharing is done by a friend of mine, the piece of art, Kristen Galerno. We grew up in the small town of Wallaceburg, and I often think that that's us in this particular piece of work, in which we're an audience and we're witnessing something quite phenomenal. As you can see by the jagged lines that are emerging from the house that's physically levitating, and there's this odd goose that is flying away. This goose is actually quite relevant to the story I'm going to share with you tonight, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But the story I'm going to share is the Baldoon Mystery, and I'm going to do so in sort of a meandering way, if you can bear with me for this time. That meandering way is overviewed here, in which I'm going to introduce a couple of terms, which I'm sure everybody who is joining us is familiar with. I'm going to talk a bit about my hometown. Then I'll get into the meat of the story that's detailed in this book. And if you're interested in locating this book, it is out of print, but you can find it on the Internet Archive. The author is Neil, N-E-I-L-T, McDonald, not MacDonald, McDonald. And it's the Baldoon, B-A-L-D-O-O-N mystery. So I'll get into I guess, the meat of the story and the poltergeist and the haunting. And then I want to weave a larger historical, cultural, social, political context by talking about historic events that happened both before and after the Baldoon Mystery, because I think if you're familiar with the work of a fellow Canadian parasociologist, Eric Ouellette, he does quite a bit of research on sort of the broader sociocultural influences or events that are happening simultaneously, maybe not simultaneously, but before and after some of these strange happenings. So I'll talk about the disaster, trauma, geopolitical strife, and then I will sort of weave some additional dimensions to the story by considering Indigenous perspectives into the Baldoon Mystery, because this happened on Indigenous land. It happened that a Scottish family and a Scottish community were at the center of the events that occurred, but I did want to give some depth and analysis to Indigenous and specifically Anishinaabe perspectives. And then I go into some theorizing, and that's where I get into the canoe of consciousness. It's just some ideas that I'm toying with, building off of William Roll's work and Jack Hunter, who I'm sure has spoken with this group, ASSAP. So ontology, homing, the long body, and then I conclude with Baldoon and the long body. So the terms, poltergeist, which I just mentioned William Roll, and one of his proteges, Brian Williams and Annalisa Ventola, offer this definition of poltergeist, which I really like. Events that are characterized by a series of apparently anomalous physical phenomena, such as the sudden movement of objects without any apparent force acting on them, and rapping or knocking sounds that do not seem to have a clear source. Like many cases of ghosts and apparitions, these occurrences have a long tradition steeped in myth, folklore, and superstitions. And I'm so happy that they included that last sentence, because that for me is the clincher. When you are considering how people talk about these events, we have to go much farther back into their cultural lineage. And then William Roll with haunting. Haunt comes from the same root as home or ham, as in Birmingham. In other words, haunting means homing and implies that a spirit has remained at or has returned to its earthly habitat. And I'm having difficulty differentiating between poltergeist and haunting throughout my research and the book that I'm writing on this topic. So I use both poltergeist and haunting interchangeably, and you'll see that both actually apply. So give me one moment. All right, so this is the center of my hometown, Wallaceburg. There's this very odd statue of a black goose sort of bisecting a circular ring. I'm not quite sure what this poem is supposed to represent, because in the story that I'm going to share with you, the black goose is anything but inspirational and this beacon of hope for the family. If anything, it's quite the opposite, and is this transformative familiar that causes a lot of havoc among the settlers. So that is Wallaceburg. As you can imagine, Wallace, yes, William Wallace. So the Scottish settlers, generations after they landed in southwestern Ontario, which was then called Upper Canada, successive generations renamed Baldoon and tried to put some distance between themselves and the disaster that I'll talk about, and identify nationally with William Wallace and referred to the town as Wallaceburg. The location. So if you were to tilt your laptop or your computer on its side, southwestern Ontario would kind of look like an elephant, with the trunk being curled up on the far end of the screen. And you see that red circle? That's really the area that I'm going to be speaking about. Detroit is just to the left of that circle in the Michigan territory. And if you look farther north, there isn't much European settlement beyond Baldoon. So Baldoon, then you get to Sarnia, and you can see London, where I'm joining you from today. Those are listed. But in 1829, 1830, this was really frontier Upper Canada, the colony of Upper Canada. And now zeroing in just a little bit closer, you can see an inland archipelago, which forms Bequejewanong territory, or Walpole Island First Nation as it's known now. And within that circle, you see where Baldoon is located. So right nestled right in to that Indigenous community. So the haunting. This is where I get into the meat of the story, and I'm going to try and recall it as best as I can. And instead of having bullet points with particular events, I am featuring local art of the Baldoon Mystery. And you can see in this one in particular, which was done in 1976, this pen and ink drawing, you can see there are diminutive people. So yes, at some point, we will be speaking about fairy folk. And I also have some quotes from eyewitnesses to the events that happened or their descendants. And I really wanted to parse out some of the really peculiar events that were happening. So if we go back to late 1829, early 1830, well, say I'm guessing August or September, we get this account of the MacDonald family under the leadership of the family patriarch John Taylor MacDonald. They were preparing for the fall harvest. And as the men were working out in the field, the women of the MacDonald family, and perhaps some of the neighboring women, were inside the barn, and they were merrymaking and singing festive songs while they wove straw hats. And as the story goes, this was the first sign of something not meshing with their reality. A beam, which was in the barn, fell down from no apparent movement of any of the participants. And it came close to striking one of the women. but it didn't. As you know, from many poltergeist cases, there are almost always somebody who gets really hurt. And that was the case in Baldoon. They stopped singing, looked at each other, put the beam back up, and no sooner had they gone back to their merrymaking, another beam falls down. And this time they probably looked at each other a bit more cautiously. They put this beam up. But then, one after another, the beams continued to fall. And these would be long wooden poles. And the women, quite frightened by this incident, ran out of the barn and sought the aid of the men of the family because they were encountering something that was quite horrific. There happened to be a fellow who was paddling by in his canoe at the time, and it's the name that you see here, L.A. McDougall, Lachlan McDougall, who was a young man at the time. And he witnessed the women running from the barn and went to aid them along with the other family members. And he begins telling a story of stones being tossed through windows, breaking them every time and landing on the floor. And again, almost always striking someone, but never hitting them. And so they knew that there was something malevolent, whether it was human or supernatural, was at work. And they quickly made the leap to it being something supernatural. So the family sought the aid of religious authorities in nearby Windsor, which is across the river from Detroit, and in Detroit, where there would have been a strong Catholic presence. They got no help from the folks in Detroit, but there was a story published in the Detroit Gazette in late 1829 that Christopher and Paul write about in the Fortean Times. And that's really a place marker for the public attention that is drawn to this story. And public attention it did get, because people by the dozens were traveling to Baldoon from all places such as Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, and of course, Upper Canada as well, just to see what this spectacle was all about. And some of the incidents that were reported include the sound of a thunderous carriage riding over the rooftop of the house in the middle of the night when there shouldn't be any sounds. Balls of fire that would travel throughout the house in witness of many people, and the balls of fire would land and then set a flame to the house. So at times, and this is from an Indigenous witness from Walpole Island, who was put to the task of saving this poor family, they would try to put out the fire, but water acted a little different than oil in dousing the flames. There are also reports of a trickster type dog that would taunt the family. It was a dog, but was very peculiar in its mannerisms. And there's one incident of two women of the family who were standing at the back of the house facing the dog. They could never quite catch it, but they said if they both went opposite sides of the house and ran around to meet at the front, they just might be able to catch this little rascal. So they did that, ran around the house and to the front, and the dog had disappeared, only to appear on the roof looking down at them with a mischievous look in its eyes. There is also that menacing black goose that I talked about just a few minutes ago. And this black goose solidifies for the family the supernatural connection. And as I will share shortly, the involvement of a neighbor who wanted to purchase their land. And of course, if you're wondering, that neighbor was a woman, because in many of these cases, if blame was to be placed on witchcraft, it was often on a woman. So the family, in their frustration, the family of John Taylor MacDonald, were looking for help from anyone. And it so happened that John Taylor MacDonald was in a canoe on the Thames River, and he came across the headmaster of the Sombra school. Sombra was a neighboring community, so many of the children in Baldoon would go to the Sombra school for their education. This was a man named Robert Barker, and he came from Michigan. And as he was chatting with John Taylor MacDonald, he asked him if he was still having troubles with malevolent forces. And MacDonald professed that, yes, we need any help. And if you can help us, please do so. And Barker did a very smart thing, although it didn't help him. He said, I will do so long as you do not pay me. And this will become very important later on, because while you might be thinking, this is such a fantastic story, and a story is all it is, there was an arrest that was made in the events surrounding the events of the Baldoon Mystery, and it was Mr. Barker. He was arrested for pretending to practice witchcraft, which would have been a fraud charge in the old British statutes that had been brought to Upper Canada as well. So Barker, before he was arrested, shared with John Taylor MacDonald that he had been reading some hexes. He had some pamphlets or books from Pennsylvania Dutch hexmeisters, and he was proficient enough to expel the evil forces that were troubling the family. So if you're familiar with any of the Pennsylvania Dutch hexes, they're very religious and Christian in nature, but they also use pagan symbols. And one of the things that Barker was using was a horseshoe. So, you know, a horseshoe that's faced to represent a chalice or a cup would be placed above the door of the entrances in the home. And there would be a missive written on a letter that only Barker saw. It would be sealed and then nailed above the horseshoe, with the intention that Jesus Christ would be writing the name of their persecutor on this letter. And the day after, they would open the envelope and that name would be revealed. Well, in the trial transcripts, we find out that there were no names ever written on any of the letters. And I imagine this happened many times. However, the letters would be found the next day in various parts of the house and not where they had actually nailed them. And Barker himself was the subject of some of the peculiar activity in which he had money gone missing. And in this book, there's another fellow by the name of Patrick Tobin who had money that had gone missing. And while they were in the house, the money would apport in the air and drop onto the dinner plates or the breakfast plates. So it'd be cling, cling for each piece of currency that would fall. And in the case of Patrick Tobin, he had been missing 19 pieces of silver and only 18 appeared. And he rather jokingly said, "You can keep the other piece," to the spirits that were doing this. And he ran out, never to be seen again. So Barker is not able to resolve the family's troubles. And he begins to attract unwanted attention himself. Community members are accusing him of being a blasphemer for his very public pronouncements, but also for his finger pointing towards women in the community. As I said, you know, at this time, if there was witchcraft to be suspected, a woman would likely be behind it. And I think in a case of some strong self-determination, I think, and I suspect that the women actually went to the magistrate and reported Barker to the police. The magistrate was in pursuit of Barker. He was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to a year in prison. And at each quarter, from sun up till high noon, he had to stand in pillory, which meant he had to stand with his head and his hands sort of encased in a wooden frame, almost like a guillotine, but without the guillotine. Barker was successful in his application to the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Colborne, to seek clemency. So I've introduced you to both the Scottish and the Pennsylvania Dutch elements There are two other elements to this story that are just as important. One of them being the Anishinaabe, the indigenous community, which also has a very unique perspective in the Baldoon Mystery, which I'll get to. The fourth one is the family compact. And if you're unfamiliar with what that is, it's basically the aristocracy of Great Britain that was imported to Upper Canada. And when it was imported to Upper Canada, I would argue that it was heightened in their allegiance to the crown and to Great Britain because they had some familiarity with what was happening with those 13 roguish colonies to the south, and they wanted to keep Upper Canada for the crown. So the family compact was a very feudal and repressive society. These settlers, for instance, they were not free people. They were indentured servants. They had landed in Upper Canada in 1804, and it took them quite a while to earn their freedom as citizens of the crown. I'm just going to move along, continuing on with the haunting and some local art. MacDonald has no luck with Barker. He seeks out another Pennsylvania Dutch hexmeister, this time a man by the name of John Troyer, who lived closer to New York, but in Upper Canada. Troyer at this time, who is one of the men featured in this piece of work, was known as a witch doctor, and he believed witchcraft was responsible for any malady. In fact, at one point, he professed that on occasion he would be visited by witches in the night while he was in a peaceful slumber, and they would transform him into a horse and ride him across Lake Erie to this place called Dunkirk Island, where they would go about their witch's Sabbath and feed him rye straw, which I had just learned recently could have led to ergot poisoning. And he would be tortured by watching the witch's Sabbath. And when he would wake up in the morning, not as a horse, but as a human, it would take him several days to cleanse his body from the curse that the witches put on him. And this had happened to him several times. So Barker, in the story, The Baldoon Mystery, employs the assistance of his daughter, who is described as being pale in complexion and of a strange set. She was a seer who consulted a moonstone and foretold of the family barn burning at that very instant, and of a black goose that was the familiar of one of their neighbors who was disappointed with a rebuffed attempt to purchase MacDonald's land. And so the resolution from Troyer and his daughter was to mold a bullet of silver and shoot said goose in the wing if they want to reveal who the agitator of the family was. So MacDonald does this. He molds his bullet of silver, and you can see in this wonderful piece of art by Kristen Galarno, he shoots it in the wing. And then, of course, the very next day, what do they see? But their old neighbor with their arm in a sling. So it's a very tried story. But we also know, for instance, that Troyer actually visited Baldoon. And that is where we get into the Anishinaabe perspective of the story, which to me is even more so compelling than everything that I've been learning up until this point, everything that I've been sharing up until this point. But it's also worth noting that there is a persistent history of the Baldoon Mystery in the community from descendants, one of which I've become pretty close with as a friend, who still talks about a family curse. And she's a descendant of the MacDougals, Lachlan MacDougall in particular, who I introduced you to earlier on. And there are still many stories that are circulated both from the indigenous community and from the white settler community. One of my family members, for instance, who's not familiar with the Baldoon Mystery, right? It's like I do talk to family members, and we don't talk about things that I'm interested in, because things that I'm interested in are probably really boring to them. And I'm sure you all have family like that. So I was chatting with a family member, and she had said that she was at a friend's house, and they were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and having a smoke. And her friend had her dogs in the kitchen with them. And suddenly they could hear this deep growling coming from one of the kitchen cupboards. And my family member said the dogs bolted, took off and hid and couldn't be found. And this growling continued. So they very cautiously looked at each other and approached the cupboard and opened it, and there was nothing there. And the growling stopped, and that was it. And in discussions with this family member, she said that her friend actually had some other events like that happen with no rhyme or reason. And the further I spoke with my family member, they shared some things that I thought, oh, maybe that there is rhyme, not reason, but there is a rhyming pattern to what you're describing to me. So returning back to Baldoon and the Baldoon Mystery. Now, I apologize for this particular image. This particular image was from a survey map done in 1809. And I believe it's the only image of Lord Selkirk's manor at Baldoon. And this particular image is probably little larger than a postage stamp on a very large survey map. So you can see the home with two chimneys. It looks like a split level home, and the flag indicating that this is British land. Now, Baldoon was founded in 1804 by Lord Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk in Kirkcudbrightshire, East Galloway. And he was a philanthropist in the early 1800s, and it was a very liberal experiment that he was trying at the time, which was to take literal boatloads of people, in this case, landless crofters, which I'm sure to the British authorities represented more of a threat than an allegiance, export people en masse to the farthest reaches of the colonies. So well over 100 settlers landed right at this location in the bend of the Chenelle-Carte River, bordering Walpole Island and being very much on Indigenous land at the time. When they arrived at this location, not a single other home had been built for the families. There were 14 family heads, which I assume meant there should be 14 homes built. Selkirk's home was the only one that was built. And it was in a season of particularly inclement weather in the land that Selkirk had chosen, so happened to be a floodplain, and he chose it during the dry season. So the settlers arrived to very marshy terrain. Within a month, winter was there. And I would say, I think the number is about 44 or 46 of the community members died within 6 months from exposure, from malaria, from influenza, from any number of ailments that can arrive from not being properly prepared for the winter. Now, the community was of all Gaelic speakers, primarily from Tiree and Mull in Argyllshire. And this experiment, this project by Selkirk, was a novel experiment, a military experiment, in fact, in which there's this quote where Baldoon would, quote, be kept distinct from the Yankees, unmixed and not hemmed in, where the object of their national distinction should be studied, to prevent their imbibing the principles and disposition of Yankees, which would otherwise pervade the whole country. So more than 100 settlers arrive, and within 6 months, half of them are dead from malaria and other ailments. Baldoon never fully recovered from this initial disaster. Administrative malaise contributed to the settlement's deprivation. And we get this quote from Dr. John Sims, who was one of the community's many failed managers. He suppressed a rebellion. This isn't an image of the rebellion. He suppressed a rebellion of the community in Baldoon in 1808 because the settlers were demanding better wages and living conditions. And he wrote to Selkirk that the community is one of red and tired eyes. And he also wrote that at times you will find a sheep that had been beaten so hard that its eyes become dislodged from its head. Now, this is before the image that I have on this screen, which is the War of 1812. Baldoon was on the front line of the War of 1812, and I would say almost all, if not all, community members in Baldoon were enlisted in the battle against the Americans. And in this particular theater, they would have been fighting the Kentucky militias, the Kentucky regulars who were coming up from the Ohio Valley, the Ohio River Valley, and fighting with both British, the Redcoats, and the indigenous nations, who were also situated in such a way as the Baldoon settlers to provide a buffer of protection for the colony. At least that was the British perspective. The indigenous people were fighting for their own sovereignty and self-determination, as I'm sure the Scots indentured servants were similarly. After the events of the Baldoon Mystery, there is another short but horrific war known as the Patriots' War. And this was in 1837. And during the Patriots' War, again, militia from Michigan this time and Ohio and Pennsylvania were coming up without the support of the American government to liberate Upper Canada, to become patriots to the American Revolution and become an additional state. While this time the British in Upper Canada populations, the indigenous and settler populations, successfully repelled the American invaders, not without committing some very horrific war crimes at the same time. Massacring Americans in the streets of Windsor, for instance. As this war was occurring, there were pirate raids along the St. Clair River and the Snai River, right where Baldoon was located. In fact, some of the MacDonald family members were taken hostage by some of the militia in the United States and held captive in some of the recessed woods of Michigan for ransom. And it was actually indigenous militia that would encircle these woods and rescue members of the MacDonald family. So the community itself has been the center of extremely horrific histories, not to mention, and I should and I will mention, the land that they had settled was considered indigenous land by the Anishinaabe. So there was already strife from the moment the first boat landed in that house Lord Selkirk's manor was built. And there were many protests from the Anishinaabe to the Crown and to military authorities in Detroit, when Detroit was a part of the colony, protesting the arrival of these settlers without treaty making. So these were uninvited guests to the Anishinaabe. They still participated in commerce with the Anishinaabe, but it was under a guise of political duress that the Anishinaabe would work with them. And those complaints and those protests, one after another, as you might have guessed, were completely ignored. And the land that Baldoon was built on was enfranchised as a township in 1820. So on that note, I am going to speak a bit about some of the additional dimensions. So recall a few moments ago, I was talking about John Troyer visiting Baldoon. He went to Baldoon, and I suspect that he was prescribing sympathetic magic to John Taylor MacDonald to build a guise of the black goose and shoot that with the silver bullet. But John Troyer was there, and he had to leave because once again the magistrate was called. And Troyer at this time was an elderly gentleman in his 70s. And he was described by the man you see in this picture as having a long flowing white beard. So looking rather wizardly. And he wore a top hat. And a long flowing white beard in 1829 and 1830, especially by a man who sees witches as responsible for all maladies, would not have been unnoticed by the community members. And it definitely would have been unfashionable at the time to have such an appearance. So the man that you see here was a Methodist missionary, an Ojibwe Methodist missionary, so a member of the Anishinaabe Nation, whose name was Reverend Peter Jones. And he was from closer to Toronto, which was called York back then. And his Anishinaabe name was Gagagawanabe, or Sacred Feathers. So this was a man who very distinctly walked in two worlds simultaneously, one being the indigenous world, in which he had audience with many of the nations in the lower Great Lakes and upper Great Lakes. But you see in this image, he carried a pipe and he wore his traditional regalia. But he was also welcome in European circles and actually traveled throughout Western Europe for 2 or 3 years, getting audience with Queen Victoria later in his life. And one of his interpreters has this fantastic travel narrative of visiting the exotic countries of Great Britain, Scotland, France, and Belgium. It's wonderful stuff to read. So Peter Jones here happens to see John Troyer making a beeline back for Lake Erie, like probably running as fast as his 2-leg, not 4-leg, because this is the guy who was transformed into a horse, you have to remember, making a beeline for Lake Erie as fast as his elderly legs can carry him. And so he stops Troyer and says, "My friend, what is happening? Why are you in such a hurry?" And Troyer opens up, talks about the curse on the MacDonald family, the curse on Baldoon, but he also talked about how he was able to bring it to an end. And then he continued on his way. Now, Peter Jones, his interest is really piqued. He visits Baldoon, but in his visit with Baldoon, nothing happened. Of course, why would anything happen when Troyer already resolved it? He reports that nothing happened while he was there, but he continues across the river to Walpole Island. And there he visits a man by the name of Bajigijigweshigum, whose name means his footprints are across the sky. And this was the principal chief of Walpole Island, or Bekajunong territory. And he offers a very compelling story. Quote, this is from Chief Bajigijigweshigum, quote, "Last spring, this white man went and cleared and burnt this grove, and the fairies have been obliged to remove. Their patience and forbearance were now exhausted. They felt indignant at such treatment, and they were venting their vengeance at the white man by destroying his property." Now, this to me is really peculiar, because in this book, there isn't a single mention of fairy folk. Neil T. MacDonald doesn't mention it once. However, 2 of the indigenous witnesses do. Neil T. MacDonald does not include a single reference. which surprises me, because if you go much further back in Hebridean lore in particular, but in Scottish lore, we see comments like this from Robert Kirk. The invisible wights which haunt houses seem rather to be some of our subterranean inhabitants, which appear often to men of the second sight, than evil spirits or devils, because they throw great stones, pieces of earth and wood at the inhabitants. They hurt them not at all, as if they addled not maliciously like devils at all, but in sport like buffoons or drolls. So why are fairies not included in the telling of the Baldoon Mystery by Neil T. MacDonald? I think there's a couple of reasons. One, nobody would want to be claim having a visitation of the wee folk, especially if they were angered and agitated. It would always be someone else, another member of the neighborhood. Or it could also be the case that Neil T. MacDonald, he wrote the book in 1871, gathered witness testimonies in the 1850s and 60s, waited till his father, John Taylor MacDonald, passed away, and then published the material. This was really at a time when Upper Canada was transitioning to Ontario, as we know it, in the generations following. So perhaps it was a welcoming of modernity. Neil T. MacDonald, as far as I know, was a riverboat captain, so he would have been transporting industrial materials across the Great Lakes and throughout and all points in between. And perhaps some distance between the wee folk and the family tragedy was a welcome thing. So shifting now to other ideas of the Baldoon Mystery, and these are the last few slides I'm going to show. In Wallaceburg, growing up, this story was common. I don't know if it's as common now. I hope it is. There's always this dichotomy between truth and fiction. So if it's true, spectral black dogs, shape-shifting witches, and aggressive little people are all part of an accepted reality. If it's false, these are folks that had wild imaginations. They were attention-seeking settlers, and yes, swamp gas. Swamp gas is responsible for the balls of fire. I was reading the personal notes of a local historian, and he suspected that swamp gas was to blame. So if you have a bingo card of the paranormal, I think swamp gas should be on it, because that is the clincher. But is this the only way to consider stories like the Baldoon Mystery from this true or false dichotomy, this binary of reason and active imagination? Or can we consider other ways of considering these stories? And for this, I really look at ontology and our makeup of reality. And this is where I draw from folks like Jack Hunter in ontological bracketing, allowing us to frame our experiences within our conscious selves. So several phenomenologists after Husserl resist the subjectivity of bracketing, making brackets a framework for knowing material reality. And this creates and reinforces ontological certainty. But we know that the settlers of Baldoon, for instance, they had probably much looser ontological brackets, if they had brackets at all. And we can see this through the influence of people like Robert Barker and John Troyer, whose assumptions lead them to blame women in the community. Or at one point, Barker said it was a woman in Scotland, trying to deflect the blame possibly from himself when the suspicions were being raised. So then we consider this notion of ontological flooding, manifesting spirits, which Jack writes about quite a bit. So ontological flooding opens the floodgates of ontological possibilities. All ontologies are on an equal footing, while bracketing protects and reinforces consensus reality. Flooding destabilizes it, questions and explores different ontologies with openness and creative intelligence. Yet, myself, I'm pretty leery of floods. I lost a car to a flood once, and I know the Baldoon settlers did not like floods, causing the deaths of several community members when they were first established. I've come up with a rudimentary but different way of approaching, or at least appreciating, such stories, and I sort of loosely call it the canoe of consciousness, where you have these active binaries coexisting and interfacing with us, the fellow traveler in the center here. So we have truth and fiction as being one binary, and we have the bracket and the flood as being the other binary. And we have the shoreline of skepticism between truth and bracket, where if you want to put some distance between yourselves and malicious wee folk and witches who can transform into black geese, that's where you need to be. But then you also have the depths of belief beneath that, which I would caution against going too deep into, because you could be swept away. And then on either side, you have real and unreal binary, and then multiple possibilities can occur simultaneously. So if you're in the boat, you're not being swept away in the flood because you're controlling the current and you're controlling where your vessel goes. Or if you're on the shore, you have some safe distance between yourself and the stories that your fellow community members are sharing. So let's consider some sort of a deeper Anishinaabe perspective from the Ojibwe. In this particular, James Dumont, in a paper he wrote called Journey to Daylight Land. And this, for me, offers some deeper perspective as to what was happening in the settlers' ontology, while acknowledging the preeminence of Indigenous philosophy and ontology. Dumont wrote, quote, "Other than human beings, metamorphosis, travel, and experience transcending the apparent bounds of time and space, supernatural dwelling places, all these can be and are personally experienced in the present. This is important. All of this occurs in the present experience. These are not mythical times or legendary episodes, but it is now of the Ojibwe that these events are experienced." So having a looser boundary between yourself and your environment opens the possibilities of, the case of Baldoon, quite horrific things. But in this painting by Morrisell, you can see there is a ceremonial practice. There are actual protocols that should facilitate the safe journey between these porous boundaries. And this particular slide leads to a connection to William Roll in his discussion of the long body, in which he wrote, quote, "The lived body is not restricted to the small or physiological body. The lived body is a long body that stretches beyond the place and time of the small body to encompass significant others, people, and things that we are close to physically and psychically." Now, in my speculation, I would say that the Baldoon settlers really missed home. And I think that they brought home with them, and they brought all aspects of home, not just the positive aspects of home, but also the negative aspects of home. And in particular, Baldoon and the long body, the Baldoon Mystery demonstrates the ways traditional stories, such as the fairy dog, can become frighteningly real to those who experience the unexplainable events. Shape-shifting witches, family curses, and histories of trauma are all extensions of the long body and reveal an anatomy that is rich with detail. Now, the terror that the family experienced by the dog that you see in this image by Kristen Galerno recalls an event that Neil T. MacDonald writes about, in which one of the barns was burning to the ground. And anytime a supposed rescuer would splash water from a bucket on the barn, this menacing dog would appear in the billowing smoke and would snarl at the approachers as if to say, mind your own business. And that's the quote that they use. One of the witnesses, mind your own business. That's what the dog is saying to them in its snarling manner. So there is a particular story from the Isle of Tiree, the fairies on Finlay's sandbank. And I'm just going to look for the citation of this particular story. It was published in 1900, The Fairies on Finlay's Sandbank, edited by Reverend John Gregerson in the book Superstitions of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, collected entirely from oral sources. It is available online on electricscotland.com. And this story in particular, The Fairies on Finlay's Sandbank, details this relationship that a family on Tiree, a family of smiths, so smithies, iron workers, have with the fairies that live in a particular sandbank. And this fairy dog, this immense being that is the protector and the intermediary between the fairy realm and the sandbank and this family of iron workers. In the story, if you want to look it up, details how their relationship was one built on reciprocity, in which a kettle was exchanged between the family and the fairies each evening and each morning. And one particular evening, the exchange happened without the proper evocation being uttered. And it raised the ire of the fairies, and they refused to return the kettle, which inspired the wife of the smith to retrieve it, and being chased by the fairy dog on the way back as she's carrying this kettle. Now, interestingly, in the Baldoon Mystery, there is an incident in which the dog, the family dog, is chased by the kettle, like a cooking kettle. And the ladle in the kettle is whipping the dog as the dog is fleeing in terror, never to be seen again except by witnesses in Michigan who said it swam across the St. Clair River and had no interest in returning to Canada. So that is where we are with our story. And I would be pleased if you have any questions. I hope I was okay for time. But yes, thank you once again for the invitation and for sharing this story, which is near and dear to me.
Rick, thank you so much. That was so enjoyable. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Loud and clear. Thank you.
I loved all the aspects of that you brought together, the Indigenous American people and the ghost stories, and it was fantastic. Really, really enjoyable. Thank you. And I think you've opened a lot of our eyes here to the story we weren't really familiar with. So yeah, that's again, you were telling me before the start of the webinar that you'd like to come over and visit Scotland, and you were explaining how so much of what you were going to talk about tonight would link in with that, and I see why now. So you must come over and see us.
Oh, I would absolutely love to. The first opportunity.
Yes, and come along to some ASSAP events if you can while you're over here. We'd love to have you.
Definitely.
So let me just go through our questions and comments.